Okay, so our next speaker is Sumi Pereira. Excuse me, Sumi. Sumi for my pronunciation. Sumi, like many printmakers, can be found on the various social media platforms. If you have come across her post, you will know she is a very prolific artist. Sumi is an interdisciplinary artist. Her work covers many directions and context, and the urban environment is just one of these. But I'm sure Sumi's going to tell you all about that right now. Ladies and gentlemen, Sumi Perera.
I'm sorry, we were asked to use the mics without just mumbling. Thank you, Nigel, again, for that introduction. So the title of my presentation is Liminal Spaces, and why I titled it as such is that my whole identity occupies a liminal space. Even my name, Nigel introduced me as Sumi. Sumi is not even my real name. Until I was asked to sign the contract forms, I hadn't even thought about it that much. My real name is Sunimali Marini Perera, that which you see there, a long Sinhalese Sri Lankan name. And my parents never even bothered to call me by my full name, and it was just contracted down to Sumi, and I've always been known as Sumi. Sumi for artistic purposes and my entire life, really. But for medical and scientific publications, I use the full title because they need your real name for such purposes. And the liminal space that I speak of, that I occupy, was made more obvious to me on the day that I enrolled for my MA in 2003 at Camberwell College. I had no box to tick in terms of my ethnic identity. They provided you with the British, Asian, Indian, Pakistani, and Bangladesh, separate boxes for each ethnic group, and there was no British, Asian, other. I just wanted other. I didn't need Sri Lankan, because there must be so many other British, Asian countries that people needed to tick. So that was my first artwork. I drew a box, ticked it, and labeled it British, Asian, other. And this liminal space that I speak of is not just culturally and geographically, but professionally too. I was born in Sri Lanka in 1956, 65 and a quarter now. I came to England in the 60s with my father, who was given a Commonwealth scholarship as a doctor, and then went back, returned in the 70s as a teenager when he was awarded a WHO fellowship, went back, and then returned in the 80s when my husband was awarded a WHO fellowship. So on paper, all this sounds quite privileged, I suppose, but the reality of it was on a foreign fellowship, scholarship stipend, we were given teeny tiny allowances where we occupied very small spaces, mostly in urban environments. So you can see how this sort of being cooped up in a tiny place, coming from a country that was where we were used to so much fresh air and large spaces, it left a huge impact within me. Apart from that, I've done many foreign residencies for quite lengthy periods, 6 weeks, etc., in Venice. And here's a place that's overrun by urbanization, and the country is, the place is just sinking. China, in the city, in Beijing, in 2008, I did a teaching residency at the Central Academy of Fine Art. And in 2019, just before the pandemic hit, I was in Yinchuan, it was called the Yinchuan Village Artists Residency Camp, close to the Mongolian border. And in France, I did a stone lithography residency in a 9th century abbey, beautiful rural France. So it's not just my native country and my adoptive country. In Britain, when we came, my father would switch between London, Glasgow, Edinburgh, back to London, and so on. I've lived in Shrewsbury, quite close to the Welsh border, so I've been dipping in and out of every geographic space, and mapping and cartography enter my work invariably. I studied medicine at university, and then when we came here in the 80s, I took time off to bring up my children. So I was a full-time professional housewife for 5 whole years, and the best time of my life, where I think I really regained my artistic practice, which I'm 65, as I said. So for 6 decades, I've been making art. And then went back, did an MSc and a PhD in virology, and worked as a scientist. Then when the children were older and they were ready for university, I went back 2003 to do a master's in book arts. So again, even from the selection of choice I took for a master's shows that I'd already not wanted to pigeonhole myself in any single discipline. I wanted to embrace every other skill I'd been acquiring for the last few decades, like blacksmithing, glass blowing, ceramics, textile, and so on. I also belong to a lot of artist collectives and memberships, some peer-reviewed, stringent elective processes, and others open, embracing artist collectives that don't go through any vetting process. Belong to an international textile group, the only drawing group that's dedicated to drawing, the SGFA, Graphic Fine Arts, and the Designer Craftsmen, founded by William Morris. I assure you they're the only slide that's going to have any text, but just to give you some background about myself before I start speaking. And the London group, which is the UK's oldest artist collective. So as this slide indicates, I'm a self-confirmed process bitch. I value process more than anything else that's produced at the end of the work. And these are just scrap pieces of paper that I've fished out of the dustbins, pieces of paper that people have thrown out, which I've manipulated and built my own urban landscape. The other fact that I forgot to mention was that I grew up in a little fishing village between the sea and the river in Sri Lanka. So I've dipped in and out of urban spaces and rural spaces, as I explained with my residencies and within my life. So I'll start with one significant body of work that changed my process more than anything else. It was following, can you hear me? Is this, yeah? It was following a visit to Frieze Art Fair in 2007. And I came away sadly disappointed. I know most years I come away sadly disappointed with Frieze Art Fair, but I still go and have a look at it. Because there was such a distinct lack of works on paper at the fair. So I came back determined to dedicate the next few years of my life just working with paper and putting the other disciplines a bit to a side. And the sponsors of the fair were Deutsche Bank, and I had some photographs of the Deutsche Bank that I had photographed in Portugal, in Lisbon, and I deconstructed the building and used the lace. First, I cut it by hand, all cut by hand bodies of work. But then this was so time-consuming, I started using the laser beam as a cutting tool. But I didn't want this same set pattern to replicate within the next few pages, and I kept using it in a. I will elaborate tomorrow on the masterclass a bit more about this process. But there was no editioning involved with the laser tool. Each piece was a unique piece. I think you may have noticed that this book was designed for an exhibition in Boston, USA, and it won the first prize at Shelter. And there was hardly any color. The end plates, these were the end papers, of the book. Again, you can see scrap paper picked up from the dustbin, which I've stitched into, but unpicked the threads of. And this book is titled The House That Jack Never Built. So it's provided as an empty cover, just the cover of the book with a lot of fragments of text and visual imagery where you build your own book, you build your own narrative and set the sequence and alignment as you wish. There's stitch involved, there's evidence of the laser beam. Most laser people who use laser cutting like a clean, crisp edge, but I want to see the flare, the burnt mark, and I push it till it's shown. this is a democratic multiple, which in artist book language, they try to make a distinction between book cards and artist books, where artist books is this cheaply produced, widely distributed form of it's almost like a political statement where masses can access this piece of work. But what within this book is all the handmade textured markings of the previous book. So and again, why I use a lot of blind embossing and sometimes pull myself away from using color is because I make books that are tactile, that even the blind reader can read by just touching it, almost like Braille. And the deaf reader, am I saying that correct? Yes. Sorry, let me say that again. So I've done a whole body of work for the Helen Keller International Award, who was deaf and blind both. So that if you're both deaf and blind, you rely totally on touch. So it's an important aspect of my printmaking process that almost everything is heavily textured and there's a tactile quality to it. The democratic multiple was featured in an exhibition in Atlanta, Pyramid Atlanta in the USA, and a review was written about this book, how still you retain the qualities of the handmade print within this digitally produced book. This is an installation from Liminal Spaces 1 at Huddersfield Art Gallery, which was a solo show that I was given as part of the Flourish Award for excellence in printmaking. And these views are a bit distorted because I wanted to show you different viewpoints of the installation from different angles. And even the plinth was designed by me for this particular piece. That's what I thought. It's my height, isn't it? Is this better? Yeah, sorry. So did anyone want to ask me anything else again on previous slides? Yeah. So this was I know what I'm doing. Can I take this off? Because I need to look at it. Could you please? I think when I turn my face away to look at the screen. Thank you. Don't worry, there you go. Super, thanks. So this was designed for Dream Space, an architect's office in central London, which you could access from 3 different tube stations. And the whole room was covered in this series of prints, which talks a lot about homelessness and shelter within central London in this posh architect's office, which is a recurrent theme and motif within the work. This next series was about the negative space of architecture, and literally the negative space. So I had spelled the word architecture using different computer fonts, and then I would only select the word outside the space, outside the lettering, and arrange it in a form of a crowded cityscape. It was shown in Guanlan and acquired for its collection. So here, if you squint and you look at the top line, you can see the words architecture spelled out, but what I'm using is the space around each letter, and then that forms the cityscape. You can see it a bit better, so I think the next slide shows it even better. So apart from just using the physical space, this is printed using dust, I'm also talking about the negative connotations of urbanization and the pollution and all the negative effects of highly urbanized communities can bring to the rest of the environment. And that sort of neatly takes me on to the next series of works that I've done for China. I've had quite strong connections with China since 2007, where I was invited to do a teaching residency at CAFA, the Central Academy of Fine Art in Beijing, spot bang in the middle of the city where there was so much pollution. And then in 2019, in this lovely village quite close to the Mongolian border, I did another residency. And I was invited by the Beijing Winter Olympics to do a series of, do a print for their international exchange exhibition. And I titled my work, The Water Cube Transforms into the Ice Cube, taking the architectural constraints of the aquatic center to, this is that, to talk about how for the Beijing Olympics in 2008, with Beijing being the only city to have hosted the Olympics twice, for the summer and the Winter Olympics. It was filled with water and used as an aquatic center. But then for the Winter Olympics, it was transformed into an ice rink, and hence the title, Water Cube, Ice Cube. Here's the preliminary drawings of the work where the cube starts melting and transforming into water, and not just the physical aspects of this transformation, but also the whole physical, the implications of the melting ice caps, etc., and climate change considerations of urbanization. It was a screen print, printed in 3 colors, and you can see the primary colors on the bottom diagonal, then the secondary colors and the tertiary colors, and so on. So they actually understood the whole implication of the work, and it was here the besides the opening entrance of the work. The colors that I used were the Olympic logo symbol circles, but it also is the same reflection of all the colors used by all the flags in the world, and with a higher leaning towards the flag of China and Sri Lanka. Those of you who may have seen the International Print Exhibition up the road would have seen the series Regeneration, not the series, but my triptych, Regeneration 3, within the show. And I think I'm just going to speed over the regeneration variations, but spend a little bit of time on regeneration on glass, which takes me back a little bit back, returning back from paper to other materials that I have been using. So this is what's there within the print exhibition. And it's a triptych using 3 separate plates. And this central plate is Regeneration 1, which was inspired by a visit to South Africa. My son-in-law, my eldest daughter's husband, was born in South Africa, in Cape Town, and my daughter worked in Johannesburg. So we did a road trip to his hometown, Cape Town, and visited Johannesburg. And it was the first time Paul had been to Johannesburg. But this structure you're seeing here is Africa's tallest residential tower. It's quite an amazing structure. I have some videos on my Instagram page where you can get the feel of it. It's been through so many regenerations, actually, of being a place of sadness and happiness. This presentation is not long enough for me to dwell upon this whole series, but it's called Ponte Tower. So we were virtually standing inside this inner part of the structure on graves of people who had committed suicide from their high-rise buildings. The the panel on the left here was taken in New Zealand, where my other daughter and her husband, Scottish husband, worked in New Zealand and took me on a road trip throughout the islands. So wherever I go, I pick up. I love the term Gemma used, urbex. I am an urbex. I explore urban landscape, and I go down inside dirty drains, ditches, wherever you'll see some of that work appearing. And the panel on the right-hand side is another visit to Frieze Art Fair, where I just took, you can see the scaffolding repeated here as well. So looking up where people don't look, and I'm quite, I'm drawn more to the unseen aspects of our urbanization than the aspects you see in front of your eyes. So that's that panel, again, let me refresh your mind, where it's printed onto glass. And this is screen printed metal oxide fired in the kiln, where the marks are integrated into the glass. And it's just one screen, this one motif that I've been using, so that with glass you can print on the reverse. Most of my prints are double-sided. There is a front and a back, but you could read both equally well. And the shadows. Shadows is a huge, important aspect of almost all my work. You have marks left not just on the substrate that you created, but when it's installed, there's another transient mark left on the walls with the work. This is a series that was shown at West Yorkshire Print Workshop in an exhibition titled Pressing Identities. And I think that is my life. I've been pressing identities all my life in whichever place I travel or work within. It's the same plate that was used here that's being used in this series, but this time introducing a bit of color, black to begin with, and then inserts of red. They're stitched. I think you can see some of the detail. You can see the straggly threads, and the stack on the right-hand side is part of a blind embossed series that is made for the Victoria and Albert Museum. So I think with most of my plates, I play with the whole non-color, blind embossed, tactile, textured surfaces, as well as introducing color. So that I retain all the aspects of it, an artist's book within that. And then we come on to another series of works that has occupied a lot of my making. It's a lot of the titles you may have noticed have similar sounding words used because it's one and the same. So in this instance, we're talking about the unbuilt, rebuilding the unbuilt, and of all the paper architects. Paper architects are those people who drew plans on paper, but they never got built, and they still remain as blueprints on paper. And of them, I think the most well-known paper architect is Piranesi, and Gemma's already covered his influence in understanding the concerns he had about urbanization and architectural responsibilities. So for this work, I selected the unbuilt elevator tower for Expo 67, drawn by Sir Peter Cook. And, sorry. And what I've done here is to take elements of his design, but I've played around with it. And this is, let's say, one of the motifs. There are two plates, and the top block and the bottom block. It's quite large pieces. And by making this sort of modular structure, I'm able to make large prints that can extend from a small print to meters. I think the largest is about 50 meters of print occupying built structures. And it also has a personal resonance because the house that we wanted to build in Sri Lanka still remains unbuilt as a blueprint on paper due to the civil war. And I think I get drawn to these aspects due to the personal relationship it has. So having done that whole series on rebuilding the unbuilt. This is another series that is called Rebuilding the Built. So it's my most traveled print, and I'll come back and explain that in a minute. But rebuilding the built is about overextension and wanting to build bigger, better homes and not happy enough with what you're living within. So this was at a time when Londoners were going mad, and if they didn't have planning permission to build overground, then they started digging underground and excavating and drilling and creating the massage parlor, the nail bar, the sauna, the swimming pool under their houses. And this process was disrupting all the adjoining houses to the point where their foundations were becoming unstable. And apart from the foundations becoming unstable, there was a lot of worry about the vehicular traffic and the sound pollution and the toxic pollution as well by these heavy goods vehicles coming and creating such a big mess and obstructing all the traffic. So this was quite an important piece of work in the canon of all the works I've done on architecture, and I think it was recognized by it being shown in almost every continent. Started off at Bath, that's where it was first launched, then to China, in Italy at the engraving exhibition, Portugal, Australia in 2 venues, Belfast, USA, Fitzwilliam, Cheltenham, and then just before lockdown, it was shown on a gallery that was aboard a ship. So it sort of seemed like a nice quarantined space as a gallery, even during lockdown, that people could go and see. So I've been speaking about rebuilding the unbuilt and the built, and now we come to unbuilding blocks, about destruction and taking apart the built structures. And this was inspired by 2 sources. Unbuilding Blocks, which was a book written by David Macaulay. It was a fully illustrated book of just black and white drawings. And in that, he spoke about the Empire State Building being dismantled block by block and sold to a rich prince in Saudi Arabia for the exchange of oil. So he was writing tongue-in-cheek, making statements about OPEC, Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, and the dialogue they have over the superpowers in the West. And the other inspiration behind the work was the United Nations building, so unbuilding blocks, and the UN building, where I've drawn inspiration from a Lego-based block that shows you how to build the UN building. And there's been various variations with this. It was awarded the Lawrence King Publishing Prize. It's been in a touring exhibition called Control Shift of the Textile Group of Artists, because when you see some close-ups, you'll see the amount of stitching in it. At the Woolwich Contemporary Print Fair, it hung from the ceiling down to the ground and trailed a bit, and it was shown in France. So here it is in its simplest form, and again you can see the shadows, the effect of the shadows. It was shown at Bankside for the RE Originals and acquired by a London design firm. This is one triptych, the one that won the Lawrence King Publishing Prize, and the slide on the left shows you the front of the 3 scrolls that hang down, and the other side shows you the reverse of the paper. And as you can notice, there's a lot of inking at the top. The inking becomes less, but I forgot to mention before anything else was, this was a etching that I made, having recovered abandoned cancelled plates from a skip in the print studio. And I stripped them and I made these etchings out of it. So that 4 basic A4 size plates that I ink differently and rotate and align and put in different sequences, so that there are so many different variations from these humble 4 plates. The inking becomes less at the bottom, and the cuts become more towards the bottom. The stitching is much stronger at the top to suggest the strength and the solidification of the built structure, but it breaks down as it goes to the bottom. Here it is with some of the colored versions in the Control Shift exhibition and the shadows. So by the pieces being cut, if you peep behind the piece, you can almost see a whole left behind imprint of just the cut work. Here it is in Brittany. And as you can see, that's unbuilding blocks. And this is 2 different versions of rebuilding the unbuilt, where the whole background's left uninked. And here's one where the whole background was colored. But I call it my rubbings. And what I did was, after I printed it, I started rubbing areas out with an eraser. So it's a bit like comparing the process of printmaking, intaglio inking, and wiping away the excess ink, but also using a rubber, a drawing tool, and erasing out ink after it's dried. And the rubbings, the eraser bits and pieces, are collected at the end of the whole process and displayed along with the prints on the ground. Some other close-ups of that. So having made this series, I did this next box set called the Unbuilt and Rebuilt. There's a typo there, it should be a T there. Unbuilt and Rebuilt blocks, combining all the 3 previous works that I spoke about for the V&A. And that's the version I made 10 years after the first one was made, where when you stack it up high, the cut bits in the middle of the print starts opening up as pages of a book. That's 10 years apart, 2 different stacks of built works. This is a reminder to get a move on. So it's going to be like speed dating from now on. We're just going to meet, greet, slides, and move on. Anything that catches your fancy, let's take it at question time. So Mind the Gap, like Gemma, I am obsessed with cracks and breaches within any built edifice. So a whole series of photographing cracks left in the urban landscape. This was when Oxford Street was undergoing refurbishment. I'd capture all the cracks, and I turned it into an artist's book. This is the one I mentioned that occupied 50 meters, which was hung within Bankside Gallery by looping itself around. The exhibition was a group of us, we are called loop artists, and it was important that there were all these pieces that looped in and out through the glass cabinets, under the glass cabinets, from the ground, climbed up to the ceiling, came down, went up again, came down. So it looped through so many spaces, but it sat quietly in the corner, looping 50 meters of print. This was another variation of Mind the Gap that I made soon after Grenfell Tower was burnt. And I had to take a few minutes to just reflect on that event. And this is, again, using one single plate and swiveling it around and building composite structures from that single plate. It's using the ceiling in the High Street Kensington Underground and using aspects from Latimer Road Underground. And you can see the opulence in the center and the almost, you blink and you miss aspects of that ceiling. And there was speculation at the time that the reason for the Grenfell tower fire was that the posh folk in High Street, Kensington, didn't like to look at the tower block across their urban landscape and asked for it to be clad in something where they couldn't see this ugly tower. And that's why unsafe cladding was used quickly to cosmetically cover the building. This series is quite a long series, and I think I better speed on. Oh, no, I still have enough time. It's Inside Out, Outside In. Is another series that occupies every nook and cranny of the built space. And I was invited to take part in the Stroud International Textile Festival. And at that time, they were building a museum in the park. And I started looking at other places that had built museums in the park. And the one that came to my mind was that started by the Serpentine Gallery. So when they were undergoing refurbishment, they started this project by asking architects to propose a building to be built in the garden, where whilst the permanent building was getting rebuilt, the temporary pavilions out in the garden were going to provide shelter for people. And the premise was that it had to be an architect who had never built in Britain before. There was no commission fee. They were not paid anything. And it was only going to stay up for 6 months, and it would come down. So it was comparing it to almost refugee camps and temporary shelters that were being built at that time, which was also of great concern to me as a bimodal emigre fleeing a country with a civil war. And what I did with this series was to make a series of, I used skins, a lot of skins, and interior intestinal structures. And tomorrow, those who are coming on the workshop tomorrow, I brought some books and some samples of this work to explain. But for the purpose of this talk, I've just selected a few books and installations. And this is me standing on the ceiling, standing on the roof, roof of the art pavilion of Whitechapel Gallery, doing a small performance. And the book opens up as before we get to the book, I'll show you a few more installations of that same series. This was at Bankside Gallery, occupying the space from the floor to the ceiling. Here you see the floor plan, and as I mentioned before, cartography and maps into the work quite a bit. This is in New Zealand, where I sent Mark Graver instructions to string threads. So there are threads and many fibers connecting the modules. This is in the Tea Embassy Gallery, where you saw the building. You can see how I'm struggling to name my own work. 12 was shown, but you can, I don't know whether you can see it from that distance, but there are drawn lines that escape the modules, going up the ceiling, coming up down the wall to the floor, and there are many drawn lines that carry on throughout the gallery. This was the Arts Pavilion. And the artist book that I said I would speak about that evolved from this series, Inside Out, Outside In, was awarded the Incline Press Award at the Society of Bookbinders Conference and competition, and also selected for the Manly Library Acquisition Award in Australia and acquired for its collection. I won't even bore you with all these philosophical musings at the bottom of the slide when it's available for viewing on YouTube. You can all read that. I'm just going to take a few minutes to talk about the importance of text within my work, like I said, about the negative space of architecture. The title here, Inside Out, Outside In. I'm quite anal when it comes to selecting titles, words, and the way it's represented. So Inside Out is an embossed font because the paper extrudes from inside and pushes the paper out. And outside in is debossed, where the paper is pushed from outside into the page. And I think it's these tiny little things that sort of make judges listen and hear things a bit more intently. My daughter said, do not use the word humble brag, but I am going to use the word humble brag. The reason I put up some of these prizes and awards that the work has won is just to encourage people to think that for a little brown person from a teeny tiny island in the Indian Ocean, it's quite wonderful to see people from different cultures and different continents hear my voice, hear what I'm trying to say in my own little space. The book opens up as a visual narrative. You don't see any text other than what's written on the cover till you come to the end of the book, and you think it's very badly bound. And you suddenly realize that they're all French flaps and folds that open up, and there's a hidden narrative within the inner side of the pages. Those who have heard me speak before have heard about the detachable spine, how the spine gets retracted and all the pages fall out, and there are secondary readings on the inside of my books. So almost always, there is always a second, third, and even more readings within the work once you think you just finished reading it. So having spoken about that, I suddenly remembered that I hadn't spoken about much of the sound installations I do. And in that series, this was another extension of the work, inside out, outside in, recording and capturing sounds, everyday sounds that you don't even know are already, even before we left the house, simple things like this. And during lockdown, I'm going to skip back. So this is the book that's in the exhibition, To Be or Not to Be. My daughter and son-in-law listening to it, and this was at New Print Prize in Manchester. So many different installations. You can see it on my Instagram account. But this is the IOOI soundscape installation, and this is it being shown in Ireland. And wherever this is printed using electroconductive ink so that they're reactive to touch. And when you touch it, tracks get activated and the print talks back to you. And during lockdown, sorry, I'm going in the wrong direction. I reprogrammed the whole circuit where this time we were hearing more birdsong, the effects of urbanization, more with greater clarity than we had before because our lives were so busy. We didn't have time to stop and think. And it's on a music stand. The music stand I have in my house is a double-sided swivel music stand because, like everything else, for me, every object has two sides to it, and both my children play instruments, so they used it where both could stand next to the music stand and play together. But I captured the sound of clapping, in praise of all the carers, but not just the carers, the dustbin collector, the supermarket lorry driver. So I would capture all these other noises that we suddenly became aware of. Then during lockdown, this was last year, another extension of IOOI was shown at Santa Fe in USA, this time considering the cusp of the inside and the outside even more intensely. And in the same show, this book was also selected, titled Habitat, and we can't talk about the urban environment without reflecting on the habitat and how much that's been altered. I think Gemma's spoken about it quite in great depth, and I've left out that whole section of work that I've done on urban decay and the urban jungle beat, the sort of conflict and forces within that, because I knew she'd be covering that ground. So this little humble book, Habitat, is photographing a hexagonal structure just outside St. Pancras railway station, international rail Euro tunnel sort of connotations within it, and featuring it where I'm going deeper inside these holes. You can see the dust. Dust is a recurrent motif within my work, shadows, and so on. And then the book, you can see the huge amount of dust that's left, and they're quite beautiful in my eyes. And from there came this other variation, Habitat 3, and never mind the print and the artwork. I'd like you to reflect on the glory of the unplastered wall, because I think that is a more powerful artist statement than anything else. But like Gemma, I just love and I get drawn to these I don't like using the word imperfect. I think it's these beautiful, untouched spaces and surfaces. And now we come to another body I made during lockdown, the Architectural Uncanny. I'll speed up soon. And this was the term, the Architectural Uncanny, is using Widler's theories and writings he wrote as a historian, architectural historian and critique, about the divide in architecture between the architects, those who wanted to build gravity-defying super structures, and the more responsible architects who wanted to build more housing for every man. And here is one of the prototypes, the AU, I'm going to call it AU. AU1 on the left, which was shown at the Art Pavilion in Mile End, and AU2, which was shown at the Cello Factory in central London. And as you can see, it's a cluttered, busy, crowded landscape intentionally. This is a shiny zinc sheet that you could see your own reflection as you looked at the work. And during lockdown, what became so obvious was that those who had a lot of money and a second home could run away into a rural retreat and shut themselves away from any sort of harmful effects. The super rich in the cities would climb up into their penthouses, and again, they could breathe in clean air. Whereas people like us had to live in these crowded cityscapes, and it was a bigger threat to the homeless people who had no shelter of any form. And this is that reflective surfaces I spoke about. And here's the lens, which most people expect to magnify detail, but it does just the opposite. It, in fact, makes it much smaller, so that when you swing the pendulum back and look at it, you can see the whole installation as one bigger picture. A lot of monoprint involved in there. This is Feeling the Blues, again, about houses we never built and the remnants we left behind in a country torn with war. And these were using indigo dyeing, cyanotype, and developed in China using screen print, etching, and stitch. And the negative space that's cut out of all these shapes are then converted into a positive shape, and they occupy another space. This is Liminal Spaces 2, solo show I had in Venice. And I'll quickly just mention this. This was a nod and wink to Martin Creed, who won his Turner Prize for a light switch going on and off in an empty room. Okay, hallelujah. It's a wonderful conceptual thought, but would you demand millions of money for something as simple as that? So for that purpose, I did the most laborious of all printmaking techniques, which is mezzotint, and I made it so that when you touched it, the lights went on and off. Here's it off, here's it on. And I used a lot of water, mud, sand from my house and from Venice to print in this thing. This is a touring show that was to commemorate the end of World War I, subliminal spaces that went to 7 venues, using a lot of fire, dust, burn marks, and my ever-present shadows. this is just a print to illustrate that the front and the back always have equal weight in my work. It was made for the RE print portfolio to celebrate 200 years of our founder father. And it was selected by the curator of the British Museum to join their collection and the Royal Collection. This is an interactive thermochromic colored version of work that when you touch the print, it changes color. And it was shown at Huddersfield in the Liminal Spaces exhibition and in Santander at Impact Conference. And this is the last print slide that I'm going to show you. This is about using the urban environment as a large billboard, as a message to people to sort of think about stuff. And it's part of a 5-year project for the United Nations to highlight the 17 Sustainable Development Goals they set. The school I went to produced the world's first woman prime minister, but it's not she that I want to talk about, but one of my best friends, Indu Dharmasena, who is now a man, happily married, successful man with a beautiful wife, actor, playwright, and film producer. And this is just sort of celebrating the urban environment as large billboards. I think it's because my eldest daughter lives in Brighton, and anyone who's visited Brighton sees the urban environment used as large, full, in-your-face propaganda. And my other daughter lives in Glasgow. Glasgow is used for the same purpose. And the last symposium I spoke at was in Belfast. And anyone who's been to Belfast sees the urban landscape being used as a billboard. Thanks.
Okay, so we'll take some questions. We've got a roving mic now, and it's manned by our roving Alan. So if you could give him time to get to you before you pop the question. So any questions? No questions.
You seem to be incredibly prolific. How on earth do you manage to create so much work?
I'm very old. I'm 65 and a quarter, as I mentioned. So I've been making work even before the Masters. It's 20 years since I did the Masters. And I think I've always loved making things. I came from that culture where we made things as children. We stitched, we constructed stuff. So I've always just been making things with my hands, and it's part and parcel. It's like breathing for me, I think.
Do you make it all, or
Oh,
do you
yes.
have
Oh, yes. Sorry, I should have said that, and that's why I am a process bitch. Everything I make on my own. I don't delegate to anybody. I don't have people editioning anything for me. The only time I had any assistance was in China, when they gave you a technical team, and they sort of expected you to use their services. But it was mostly to teach the technical staff your methods and your practices. So it wasn't for the sake of editioning. It was more to explain to them my process. No, I make everything myself, even the glass firing. I screen print ceramic oxide, and anyone who has screen printed ceramic oxide will know how difficult it is, because it's a thick, gluey substance that you're pushing through a fine screen.
Would you say that new technology is becoming more increasingly important in your process? Because throughout your slides, you seem to be delving deeper into process. So like using the chromophone, the heat sensitive, like
the
prints.
thermochromic ink.
Yeah.
Yes. I think I can't help my scientific brain kicking at times and try and push the boundaries of what ink does, not just as a color additive, but ink as a vehicle to either conduct electricity or change color. And so I think it's not imperative, but I think why not? If I can use it and I know how to use it and I know how to control it, I will. So in control shift slides, again, there was a lot of thermochromic ink because you could control the color of those panels by just touching it. And if it was on a hot day, the panels changed invariably. And I think that's an important aspect in our mind, the thermochromic. But if you leave some prints out in harsh sunlight, those prints are going to change anyway. So even without fancy substances and fancy technical know-how, I think ink is a fugitive substance. I think that's why I relish the effect of shadows on walls and everything as well, because throughout the day, the whole installation keeps changing. So as the sun beams hit it, or if you play around with the spotlights in a built space, the whole installation acquires all kinds of different variations.
Thank you, Sumi. That was amazing. We're going to take a lunch break now, and we should be back around about 1:45. So thank you very much. So we'll carry on now with our next speaker, which is Gail Brodholt. Gail is a painter and a printmaker of the contemporary urban landscape. Her work depicts the London transport network and the journeys made across the city on tubes, trains, and in the car. The unconsidered backdrop to our daily lives. Gail is based in Woolwich in London and currently holds the post of Honorary Curator of the Royal Society of Painter Printmakers. So please welcome Gail.
Right, okay. Hello, thank you, Nigel. Get my clicker. Start. There we are. So thank you all for inviting me to speak today, and I'm glad you've all come. I'm a Londoner. I grew up in South London. My father was Norwegian and my mother was West Indian. They met when my father was in the Norwegian Navy, and they moved to Norway to be with his family. But it was just so cold for my poor mum that they decided to come to London, and that's where we stayed. So a little bit about me, just very quickly. I took a degree in fine art painting at Kingston Art College. We spent the first year doing a term in the printmaking studios, a term painting, a term sculpting. And in the printmaking term, we did screen printing, lithography, etching, everything. And it was an absolute whirlwind. And to be honest, I was quite glad to get back to the painting studio, the sort of relative calm. And that's where I stayed for the next 2 years, where I finished my degree. So I carried on painting until my children went to school, and then I signed on at a couple of classes, and that's where I started. Lino cuts appeal to me in particular because it's a simple process, and certainly to start with, you don't need much equipment. Your kitchen table, a few cutters, maybe a barron or even an old tobacco tin, something like that to rub your prints. And also, I'm a terrible one for detail. You know, I'd put literally the last shoelace in if I could. And so with lino cuts, you have to edit right down to the bare essentials because, you know, essentially you're just cutting away at a piece of lino. So this is my studio. I share it with another printmaker, Louise Davis. She's an etcher and I'm a lino cutter, so we complement each other quite well. It's also nice to share your studio because you get a bit of company, a bit of support. It can be very intense if you're just literally working on your own all the time. And that's my Albion press. It's made in 1841 and it's where I print all my lino cuts. I bought it on eBay many, many years ago. He actually bought it to me on the back of his trailer all the way from Norfolk. You know, now, what I know now about cast iron presses, they're very fragile. They may look very sort of brutal and heavy, but they're actually quite fragile. Being cast iron, they can crack quite easily, and if that happens, well, it's very difficult to mend them. And that's the view from the other side. I work in a purpose-built studio in Woolwich. There's a lot of units there, 400, I think, all in Victorian warehouse.